Welcome to our first evening keynote, and these tend to be evening London time. These tend to be a little more free-ranging than those which are strictly to do with our thematic content. But to introduce this and to introduce the speaker, Nigel Coates, director of Nigel Coates Studio, designer extraordinaire. Welcome back, and please do the introduction.
Thank you so much, Paul. What a pleasure to be triangulating with London and Seattle. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Alan Maskin from Olsen Kundig, a historic practice with an extraordinary number of employees, one of the big ones, 200, I believe. Anyway, today, Alan will be discussing many of his projects, several of his projects, and I've done a bit of research myself and know that they're incredibly interesting. So over to you then, Alan.
Thank you, Nigel. Hello, everyone. I wish that we were all in Lisbon this evening, and afterwards we could all go out and have a drink and continue the conversations there. Maybe in the future that will happen one day. I want to begin by talking about, for many of you that are in Europe and other places, it's in the evening or late afternoon, and for us, we're just starting our day here in Seattle. I am an owner of a firm called Olsen Kundig. I want to just put into context that Seattle, as I'm sure many of you know, is in the upper left corner of the United States. And if you were a little kid in elementary school, and when I was going to school in the 50s and 60s, these are the maps that would hang in the room, and it was, in a sense, the sort of first geographic understanding of where we were in relationship to the world. But if we're going to be looking at the Pacific Northwest and the influences and the design influences, then it really is better to actually look at the formation of the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific Rim. And when we talk about what it means to be from this place, what we share with people in the northern portions of the Pacific Rim, in parts of Asia and Russia certainly, is this aspect of landscape and nature. And I think for the past 100 years in the United States, this is one of the main sort of influences and driving forces. So very different from if we were from Miami, for example, or New York City. There's much more of a sort of relationship as we sort of look to the West and the East. One of the things that speaks to us and has influenced us as students and practitioners through over the years is the role that materiality plays in relationship to the ways that we inhabit sites. And the fact that the materials of the buildings that are made are often the very same materials that come from the place. And that is shared here because we have an abundance of forests, and actually renewable forests that allow us to sort of continue to work with these materials. But there's another piece that I think we do borrow from our sort of Asian influences, and that is the notion of taking big ideas and carrying them down to the finest details and to craft. And so this notion of structure and detail is inherent in the projects. But when you understand the Pacific Rim and you look at what created the Pacific Ocean, which are these tectonic boundaries, when we talk about it, we say that we're from the unstable edge of the Pacific Rim. And by unstable, we mean that the Pacific Ocean is surrounded by seismic faults that are a collection and a series of volcanic mountains that are linked literally along the entire outline of the Pacific Ocean. And there's an aspect of what it means, I think, to live on this unstable edge where anything can happen at any time, and things happen that are unexpected and often seismic. And if you carry that to culture and the ways that we think about culture, and this is one of thousands of examples where creative individuals that came from this place, and I'm talking about the Nevermind tour of Nirvana, which Dave Grohl just described in an interview last week, the drummer. And it was a seismic cultural event that happened as they toured around the United States and then returned back to Seattle, where the origin of this place. And they changed culture and they changed music, literally seismically. I was not born here. I was born on the East Coast of the United States, and I came out to go to school here, and then I ended up staying and developing my practice. And so I'm sort of a migrant to the West Coast of the United States and the upper West Coast of the United States. But it was here that I found a firm that I landed in over 30 years ago, and it's a firm where I'm now an owner. And I work in Olson Kundig with our founder, Jim Olson, who is still practicing in his 80s all around the world, Tom Kundig, Kirsten Murray, Kevin Kudo King, and our newest partner, Hemanshu Parwani, who is our CEO. Now, we meet as a leadership group running a design firm of 230 people, and we often meet and have retreats to sort of keep planning for the ambition, because we're entering our 6th decade of practice. And one of those, I asked my partners, why are you in a firm? Why are you in a collective? Any one of you could have had your own firm and had your own individual practice. And Tom told a story that I thought was actually, that really has informed this. And he is a mountain climber or a rock climber. And he described doing solo ascents and growing up in this, for part of his life in this state where there are mountains that can be climbed. He would do solo trips. And he found that it was a remarkable experience to climb these things on his own. But he described that when he hooked up to other individuals and actually climbed, that the shared experience was infinitely stronger and more meaningful to him. And so we've carried that metaphor to the fact that architecture is an extreme sport and design is an extreme sport on many, many respects. And we have investigated the idea of what it means to literally rope up with other people and move. This was pre-pandemic, this photo. We've now grown to 230 people. We are back in the office. All of them are vaccinated to our thrill and amazement, but we still are wearing masks. But this group that we are roped up to includes architects, interior designers, digital artists. There are sustainability strategists. There's a gizmologist that works on the engineering of kinetic pieces for the buildings that we do that have parts of pieces that move. And it is this collective and this moving between the individual and the collective that has inspired what I'm hoping to talk about. There's 2 cultural things that we do that I want to share with everyone, which is that one of them is every Thursday. We've done this for 40 years. Every Thursday, an individual in our firm will get up and share a project that they're working on. It's at 4:30, end of the day. There's beer and there's food and wine to help get people to step away from computers, put pencils down, and they describe a project that they're working on. And this is our building performance director, Vikram Samy, for a competition, that internal competition that we held last week or 2 weeks ago. This idea that individuals are coming up, sharing their ideas that they are working on, their design ideas, and then presenting them to the larger collective of dozens and dozens of other people means that the individuals are tapping into the brain trust and the creative sort of thinking of dozens of other people. And they're getting this sort of supportive feedback and how they can get their ideas and to make them stronger and better. This has been a ritual that we are like adamant has happened. It happens every Thursday without fail. It's a variety of design conversations that happen. And it's critical, I think, to our practice. We also have something called the International Internship Program. And this is a program that I helped start about 25 years ago, where we get people who are newly graduated out of design schools and integrate them for 6 months into the practice of the office. And they're the first thing you will see when you walk into our office. They make models, they work on projects, but they also have architects who are mentoring them every Thursday. They actually are taken to job sites. They're being eased into the profession as opposed to just being dropped in, and the suddenness of how shocking that can often be. But we ask one thing of them, and they work as a collective, but each one of them has to stand up and do what I'm doing right now, which is give a presentation to the entire office. These are the posters that are announcing each of their individual presentations, where they get up and they share their work, their ideas, and their values to the others. It is this juxtaposition of what we bring as individuals and what we do and achieve as a collective that's where I wanted to go today in the conversation with all of you at the festival. It's the tension between the autonomy and the collective, and asking 2 questions. What's the value of solitude that we bring to our practices, even when we're working with many other people? And then conversely, and we've asked this question on projects, and I'll show you more about this, we ask the question, what can we do together that we cannot do apart? And that for us is if Olson Kundig could do it on its own, then the logic of it doesn't exist for collaboration. There has to be this piece where everyone is bringing something that's getting things to change. When I went back to think about my beginnings as a designer and when it is my own sort of voice began to be established, I realized that I became an architect because I loved to draw. And one night on a flight to a meeting in Asia, I put together essentially a short animation that for me was beginning to think about where the origin of this kind of design solitude began for me. This is me in my first grade. I was about 6 years old. I'm sitting in the center. Once a week, my teacher would leave, the door would open, and a cart would roll in with art materials. Now, this is my memory and not yours, so you have to take my word on this. But my memory is that the art teacher was a giant, the tallest person I can remember. And this giant would distribute pieces of paper that we would all draw on. And so I hammered out a drawing, and at one point, this giant was standing over me and grabbed this drawing and held it up and showed it to everyone in the room. And I had drawn a hockey skate that I had gotten as a present over the holidays, and I used my crayon to bang in the sort of texture of this kind of pointillism impressionist drawing. And he cleared his throat, got everybody's attention, and he said, "This is good." And it was the first time in my life of 6 years that anybody had told me that I was good at anything. And it began a path of using drawing as a design tool that I carry with me to this very day. But I'm not just interested in my own drawings and my own sketches. I've been using the ability to get others to draw and clients to draw and collaborators to draw on projects pretty much since the beginning. In this instance, I'm working on the Bezos Center for Innovation. It's a museum project that's about the history and the future of innovation. And my colleague Marlene and I were actually working with middle school kids. And we wanted to know if visitors, it was a beta test essentially, if they were to come to this museum, could they innovate on the spot? Could they be creative? Could they solve design problems literally in this museum? And so they generated a series of questions in terms of things that they thought the world needed. And one kid in that room thought the world needed a robot that could take care of pets. Another kid took that prompt and came up with this design. And you can see the aspects of problem solving for something that doesn't even exist. We had dozens of these, and we realized that in fact kids could do this, and it actually led us to create the design of the project. I started doing this back in a project in Los Angeles decades ago, and it's called Noah's Ark, located at the Skirball Cultural Center. And in the very beginning of the project, in terms of community engagement, we went out to meet with really young kids throughout the community. And I was interested in getting them to draw. And so we wanted to know what they knew about the Noah's Ark story. What resonated with them? What was visceral? What would they really feel? And so we gave them these blank 4 squares, and they could write or draw anything they want to. And we brought them all, about 75 drawings, back to Seattle, and we analyzed them. And what we noticed was that every single kid drew the same thing, drew it differently, but they all drew this notion of a ramp with animals walking on the ark. In our conversations, that never came up. But in their drawings, we realized this was an iconic thing that was memorable for them. It was visceral, and we needed to integrate that into the design of the project. We literally, and I steal from children all the time, took their drawings, turned it into an exhibit that would reset itself, that allowed them to capture this moment. And the client has told us if there was any piece of this entire installation that they would replicate, it would be this one. So this idea has carried on. We've just opened a children's campus in Sausalito. It's a campus that's an educational learning environment. And there was a grove of trees, and we wanted to make eucalyptus trees that we wanted to make a climbing structure. So again, before we had our own ideas, we started with getting kids to come in and show us what would be visceral for them. What would they love to see? And these are a series of drawings that they generated. And when we studied them, we saw patterns. And we began to build on these patterns, and then literally taking their drawings, again, from young kids, drawing by Emerson on the previous ones, and then people on our team start to develop those into some design ideas. It becomes the genesis for the things that we fabricate and that we build. But there's a very strong tie and connection to what it is we learned from our clients, basically, and what it is that we ended up making. And over again, these tend to be some of the most interesting pieces. There's other installations that happen throughout this campus. It's an old military campus that's been turned into a learning center for children about creativity. And there's a period in our lives when we're between 7 and 9 years old that for some reason, and this happens to everyone does this, children draw in section. And we were super intrigued with this. And so we studied these drawings in this, because that's the age group that would be coming here. And you can see that they're drawing the outsides of the building and the insides and the interiors, including even on vehicles. And there's a car on the right. So we created an entire space based on this idea that developmentally kids think in section. We cut a Mini Cooper in half to just create the sense of curiosity that there's something going on inside almost every machine and every industrial designed object in every building. And so they literally can play in this entire house that is cut in section, including refrigerators, toilets, bathtubs, and a variety of areas. So building on where kids are at developmentally. I mentioned earlier that we live in the land of earthquakes and we live in the land of volcanoes. And this was a volcano that is in Oregon that erupted 40 years ago and had a tremendous impact on the Pacific Northwest at the time. The sister earthquake of that is called Mount Rainier, and you can see it in the right in the back. And it is a presence and a reminder every day of what it's like to live in a zone like this. And the best place to view that from is the building on the left, which is Seattle Space Needle. It's the icon, it's the symbol of the city. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do a sort of massive redesign of this building that was made in 1962. And so I want to talk about this notion of sort of autonomy and the collective in relation to the creation of what was, for us, was one of our most sort of important projects. Now, Seattle's surrounded by water, as you saw in some of the maps. And so, every morning I live 30 minutes across from Seattle, and I take a boat across. And you can see the Space Needle if you look really carefully on the left. And so I literally, for years, for decades, before I even got the project, I would be looking at the Space Needle and thinking about it. And then we got the project, and I began. I start my day in solitude, and I start sketching and drawing. And that's where I started to actually do drawings about this project. The drawings are not beautiful. They are not to be framed. They're not museum quality work. It's just design ideas and experimentation and actually taking these in. And then when I arrive in Seattle, I meet with a team and we begin to go through the ideas that have been generated in quietness through drawing on my way to work. But it's at that point that the project actually moves to a larger collective. And this is the team of people that I worked with. They're architects, interior designers, managers, detailing specialists. They're going to help realize this sort of massive $100 million reinvention of a landmark that had actually grown quite tired over time. The correlation between an idea, even a bad idea, like the one on the left, where we would have these glass elevators that would drop out of the bottom of the Space Needle, get developed, but every individual that's working at this point, when they're detailing it or building this or rendering it, is adding their own design pieces. They're filling in blanks with their own design ideas. And it's an indication of how design collectively happens at every level of a firm, from interns to people that have been working for decades. When we took on this project, we made a three-dimensional model, a digital model of this space. And because it was digital, it allowed us to hit the delete key and to erase. And so when the elevator opened and you went up 500 feet in the air and you literally, the doors to the elevator opened, this is what you saw. And it was 50 years of really bad remodels and readditions. So we looked at subtract before we started to add. So we hit the delete key. And when we did that, we realized that we had a much wider view. And in our research, we discovered in 1962, this was the biggest glass panels that we were able to get. So, but nowadays, the technology of glass has changed exponentially. So we removed and deleted those walls. And what we were basically doing was actually opening the lens in the visitor's eye, in their pupil, and allowing them to actually see more from the interior to the exterior. This is what the project ended up looking like as it evolved and as we continued to erase and literally taking away. This was a massive interior re-understanding, making things that had never existed before in the design of the project. This is an image that we used long before construction documents were complete but we were making the world's first rotating glass floor. This is a floor that is 100 feet, which is what, 30 meters-ish in diameter, that actually rotates and moves and is structural glass and allows people to look at Seattle in a way that they've never seen it before. And what's interesting is that we added 200% more glass to the project from what was designed in 1962. And in our minds, that adds up to adding 200% more view. So this is a project that became about how people observe cities. Constantly going back between the technology of the motors that it takes to run and move a glass floor in perpetuity around this space, and also to engage people. Now at this point, I started with a single sketch on a boat, but now we're adding dozens of consultants and dozens of builders. And to make a project that's 500 feet in the air, you might as well be building in outer space. So we began to build prototypes and test things. And it's a good thing we did, because we had to revise a lot of the design strategies in the prototyping of this project. But the detailing and the things that individuals brought to this project, down to taking the ideas to the finest details, were about what the team brought and their ideas of building on it. When construction began, actually late one night, a scaffolding was literally raised from the base of the building, literally up underneath the Space Needle. And then it was adhered on to the underside of the building so that contractors and builders and all of us that visited the site could actually observe what was going on underneath as well, without having to rope up. The building was covered for the period that it was under construction, but a portion of it was always open during construction, which added its own sense of challenges to the design. This is our my colleague Blair and I visiting the site with the main foreman of the project, and this is the glass floor that will be added, and this sense of subtraction, of taking things away before we add the glass pieces and transparency. This is the finished project. It is, again, all about observation. It has the latest technology used in understandings of glass. It has changed the visitor experience. People are not sure if they're going to be able to walk on a glass floor, for example. Almost everybody goes further than they think they will. But their senses is in the way that they engage the project is not just their eyes, but with their entire bodies. And that became something that to us was extremely important. But there's one last piece I want to highlight, which is a photograph that I saw when a building was under construction. And this is it at sunrise one morning. But if you zoom in really carefully, you can actually see that there's an individual, one of the contractors. You can see the cable that is holding him onto the building is actually literally looking at the morning sun and the landscape. And he has the Space Needle and the view, like being on the top of the mountain, he has it to himself. And there is that piece. Every time I give a lecture on this building and talk about it, I always have people coming up afterwards and saying, my grandfather was an electrician on the original building in 1962, or my grandmother worked there during the World's Fair when it opened. Every one of these people is leaving their fingerprints and their legacies, and I'm sure this person's family is going to know what it is they did when they worked on that project. I now want to shift from the autonomy piece to the question of what can we do together that we cannot do apart. And for us, that happened in a recession, the previous recession to the one that we experienced during the pandemic, when lots of storefronts in our neighborhood had actually forfeited on their leases and closed because of the economic challenges of that particular time. So we opened up a community engagement design project, and we called it Storefront. And we created a series of installations over 2 years. And the first installation was called Record Store. And it built on the idea, and we collaborated with the Seattle Art Museum and also with this individual. His name is Bernie. And Bernie had a record collection of 2,000 LPs. There is nothing more personal or for any of us than our music collections. They speak to who we are and what we like. And Bernie had 2,000 albums that he wanted to get out of his garage. So we used those. He had music from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in that 2,000 LP collection. It was gospel, it was hip hop, it was rock. It showed all aspects of music. And there are many people that would come in and visit us that actually had never experienced LPs. And so during the day, even though we're running an architecture firm, we would take turns opening the store, and people could come in and they could browse and do the things that they used to do in record stores and actually listen to them on turntables. And then it was open every night. And there were parties and events, but there was a level of engagement where people could come in on their own, but also that a community living room was created where people don't often come together around notions of music and this original collection. But on top of that, we would invite people from our community to come in, and we had two criteria, and to speak about their own lives. And this is Samantha, and she was coming in, and she had everyone that came in, and again, it was every night for 2 months, had to use the 2,000 records to tell stories about their lives, their beliefs, their work, and their values. And what we discovered was that there was all these lenses to understand a design project or an imperative of a collaboration, and that each of these people brought their own worlds with them. So it was a way of increasing visitorship and really getting things to evolve. It was so successful, it got a lot of attention as a project, and it was very successful as a community project here in Seattle, that we had our crit that I showed you earlier, and we were like, okay, what are we gonna do next? Because we didn't have a clear idea what this project should be. On the left are my notes where, literally probably 80 of my colleagues had ideas about what the next installation should be. But one of them, item number 41 from Gabriella, was an idea that we should actually look into urban agriculture, and we should turn the place that used to be a record store, and now we wanted to turn it into a farm to grow food, because turning cities into places of food growth is something that we will need in the future. And we collaborated with a think tank called CL7. This is the next installation, which was called the Mushroom Farm. And the way that this began was that we actually built a building within the building of sorts that we could control the temperature and the humidity. And we made all the parts. We had a $1,000 budget, and it was sweat equity at night and weekends, where we're not working on the architecture projects. We were building these projects. And this became a place where we were going to control the humidity and the temperature and grow mushrooms. Now, this was an experiment. We had no idea if it would work. And that was the beauty of having an experimental design space. And so what would happen is we would take these white buckets and we'd go to the coffee shops in our neighborhood, in the Pioneer Square neighborhood of Seattle. And the coffee shops were thrilled to participate. They would give us the used coffee grounds at the end of the day, and they'd bring them back. And then we would inoculate them with mushroom spores, working with an organic farmer from just north of Seattle who has mushroom farms. And we were growing oyster mushrooms. And every day the space was open, and visitors could follow the experiment, see if we were going to succeed or not. Our neighborhood would wander in, have their lunches here, see if the mushrooms were growing. There's no more Zen activity than watching mushrooms grow, I should share. But what happened is that after 5 weeks, we had nothing, and we were sure we were going to fail. And then this started to happen. And suddenly they exploded in these oyster mushrooms. And we were able to have community gatherings that actually happened within that space, where we were having organic farmers and food activists, people coming in that were urban designers, planners, and having dialogue around the concepts of the future of food and what it is the world will need. I'm going to wander into a variety of different kind of projects just to show the range and scope of things we work on. And the next project is called the Fifth Facade. And sometimes I'm sure all of you find that you're working on projects. We got to design 3 rooftop parks in South Korea on tops of buildings that were sort of massive parks that we never imagined working on. But we wanted to do some research and actually begin to develop what we call the fifth facade. So if a building has 4 facades, this is our view out the windows of our studio. You can see the unutilized upper layer of cities that actually exists. And going back to drawing again, my colleague Jerome and I decided to make a mural, a drawing that you could step inside of. And we started to reimagine Seattle's rooftops and began to integrate different ideas about how they would evolve. And because you literally could step into this drawing, basically, we would invite urban designers and sustainability thinkers and educators, historians, to come and talk to us about the development of the creation of this project. And then because it was a charcoal drawing on canvas, we could actually smudge out and erase certain areas and revise it and change it based on the dialogue and the conversations we were having. This led us to ask, what should we do? We have a big drawing, but what should we do with it? and it led to the beginning of 3 design competitions that we actually entered. The first one was this mural. What could we do with it? How could we use it? Where could we sort of continue the development of this piece that we had done as internal research? And one of our colleagues made us aware of something called Fairy Tales, which is the largest architectural ideas competition in the world. They get 1,500 entries every year. And so we decided that we would use the mural and actually do that. And one weekend I went out to my property where my partner lives, and I wrote a story, a science fiction story. I'm not a writer. I had never written a science fiction story, but we were required to include a 1,500-word story and also to create 5 images that actually describe. And this story was about an architect who dies, has his head severed and frozen, and then comes back years later to a different landscape. At one design meetings, I said, we have to find an old architect that we can actually use for this. And it was very quiet in the room. And then one of them said very bravely, well, you're old. So I became that sort of visual subject for how this integrated. And these became hybrid storytelling design ideas where you can see the mural being integrated with photography and digital artistry. I love to get designers on our firm to think about things other than buildings because I love the way architects think and designers think, and I wanted to apply that to other medium. And so we were waiting to hear on the competition. We were sure we wouldn't win because there were 1,500 others that would be entering. So I asked them to take the story, take the mural, take the competition drawings, and make a film that told the story. And so architects sat down, they figured out editing software, and these are just still shots, but they literally use the environment around us to create a short film. And then to our kind of thrill and amazement, it was accepted at 4 different film set festivals located around the country. And for us, it's an unusual place for our firm or even for architects to end up. And trying one last time, say, let's push it even further. Let's try in a completely different design medium, putting different folks on. At this point, I am really stepping out and others are in the firm are taking these ideas and building them. We created a graphic novel. And the only rules were they had to use all of the deliverables that we had made previously and integrate them, the film, the mural, the competition renderings. And this is something we made 1,000 copies of. And in the days when we would travel to work on projects, we would always leave some in coffee shops in the cities that we would visit as a way of distributing it anonymously. And then one day on the boat in the morning, I got an email. And again, to our amazement, we actually won the competition. This led us to enter competitions. And I know in Europe, competitions are an everyday part of practice. But in the United States, that's less the case. But the Bob Dylan, the American sort of musician and writer and performance artist, actually sold his archive of over 100,000 things, most of which had never been seen by anyone. And the idea was to propose in the competition some ideas around how it is that you would sort of engage that work and present it. We were fascinated by the film by Todd Hayes that is actually about Bob Dylan. And was interesting to us is that they told the story of Bob Dylan through 6 different actors of 2 different genders, multiple races, and multiple ages. This multiple perspective in telling the story of one artist was inspiring to us. This occurs in cinema in many ways. And in Kurosawa's film Rashomon, one single incident occurs, but he shows the perspective that's different and changing from many people that witnessed it and how radically different their views can be. It was that approach that we thought was ideal for an enigmatic artist like Bob Dylan, or at least I think he's enigmatic, who has always avoided definition and explaining who it is and what he does. So we have gathered together, and this is the opening list, and it's a roster that will continue in perpetuity as they visit the archive and can actually discover new things about his work and tell new stories about the ways that he engages. These are the first 5 people we'll be working with: filmmakers, historians, a US poet laureate, a specialist on creativity, and an actress currently appearing on Broadway in a play based on Bob Dylan's music. Internally, we actually put up this poster to announce the crit because I've explained how critical it is to our projects. And we actually spent one night, and this one went on for 5 or 6 hours. Usually it's about an hour conversation. This one went longer. So we definitely had a little bit more food and wine and beer. We had a turntable, and one of our architects was a DJ, and she played the songs of Bob Dylan as the people built site models and actually things that we could plug in. And we were able to actually use the collective brain trust of all the people we work with to have, I think, over 60 different examinations, personal ideas, autonomous ideas about what this project could be that would allow us to synthesize this into the final project. This project will open this coming May. The last competition I want to share with you is one that is actually an international competition. It was our first. It was at the Jewish Museum of Berlin. The competition site, as you can see here, it's a series of buildings, a very famously Daniel Libeskind's building addition done in the 90s. And this was going to be the newest addition to their campus. And these are our early architectural renderings and studies for the competition, where we're going to take an old building and reuse it and completely make a building within the building. And we were inspired at the time, so this was about 6 or 7 years ago, when Germany was accepting over 1,000 immigrants and migrants who were escaping persecution from other parts of the world. And that to us was to make a place where all these, and many of them were moving to Berlin and the neighborhood where this project exists. We wanted to make a project that actually would allow them and welcome them. And so we actually built or worked with the museum educators and created a design advisory committee. And you're looking at them here. There were 21 representatives from these different communities that invented a name for the project, critiqued the design, came up with their own design ideas. Because this is a project that is about flood narratives and ancient flood narratives, but also the contemporary flood narrative that's being written in our daily lives in relationship to climate change, we asked really young people to solve a world problem, which is how would they save people and animals today if there was in a flood. These are models that these kids built in relationship to their solutions, and that became one of the exhibits in the project. The project competition and renderings that we're sort of moving through here, and then the finished project, it did open during the pandemic. This is an interior courtyard that it will be filled and used in a variety of ways. It's an unheated concrete shell and a heated building within a building. So there's all sorts of sustainable strategies and daylighting strategies and energy saving strategies that are integrated. But in addition to the community engagement of working with community members as part of the design team, we also galvanized a team of artists from Berlin and literally handed the project to, and much of the creativity portions of it to them. And there was a team led by Anna Metz, a conceptual artist in Berlin. And she actually had 20 artists from the Berlin area. And all we asked was that they create and populate this arc of the future with animals that were created out of salvaged and this was the requirement. They had to be salvaged items and they had to be repurposed. And so that was the genesis for the creation of these projects. They made an extraordinary, I love the way of integrating artists and others into these projects. This is a rhinoceros that's made out of fire hoses. You can only use fire hoses in Germany for a certain number of times, and then they must be thrown away. And so every part of it was used. Bicycling is really, really big in much of Europe, but also very much so in Berlin. Lots of broken bicycles, over thousands of bicycle parts used to create a sloth that hangs off the sides of the building. And so the building is really waiting to welcome people back. On a very, very different note, I'm going to sort of go through a project that we called City of Loneliness. And this is a project that we were asked to do. Their client wanted it to be inspired by the films of the director Wong Kar-wai, in particular a movie he did called In the Mood for Love. When we studied it, we realized that he was influenced by Alfred Hitchcock and by the painter Edward Hopper. So we began to sort of create a cinematic spaces or cinematic architecture, and the idea of capturing this and making it feel like you walked into a film. And so the team went to a neighborhood that's literally blocks from where I'm sitting right now. It used to be called Chinatown, now it's the International District. And they created 3D models of many of the buildings that were there. And we couldn't fit a 5-story building into a 20-story, 20-foot tall, or what would that be, 6-meter high space. And so we began to create a collage of a neighborhood in Seattle that would become the background for this city. And we began to transition from the digital models to actually we built these digital models. I want to show just one piece in the sort of storytelling of the design, but we had one incredibly inventive architect here that made a model that allowed to look at a design project 3 different ways. This is an aerial view where you can study the streets. You can study in section to see the inside and outside relationships of the building. And then he put a hinge on it that allowed the model to be opened, and you could study the building in elevation. So 3 different ways through one model to actually study a project that kinetically changes. And we began, as we added artists and others to the project, we knew that we love street art and graffiti. And we thought if we were making this collage city that we could actually have a graffiti artist come and tag the city. And so we hired a remarkable graffiti artist from Reno, Nevada. His name is Eric T. Burke. And he actually came and tagged the project for us and did his own installations. But even in the documentation of the project, where we all come and we photograph the projects afterwards, this sense of cinematic space was something we wanted to capture in the photography. And I went to art school before I went to architecture school, and I was a few years behind Cindy, who was become a very famous artist and photographer, and she did a film stills series that was the beginnings of her career, where she made images that looked like they were film stills for films. So we did hire this documentary filmmaker from our area named Austin Wilson. He does a lot of music videos and rock videos, and he's never done movie stills or worked with a still camera. So I love actually pushing that. And then one of the architects had incredible sensitivity for being an art director, and he took on, and that's Tay on the right, and he took on, and not only was one of these sort of models that would be in the thing, but costumes, makeup, building the talent. And we created this photo essay of the spaces that were created, and they're mostly restaurant spaces on the top of this building, and actually showed the ways that we integrated and borrowed from the past to inform, and the works of others, to inform this notion of creating cinema, or the feeling like you were walking into a movie. I'm going to close with death, but an optimistic aspect of death. One of the projects I'm working on now is the invention of Christina Spade, who is my friend. And Christina studied architecture, and her master's thesis was on the recomposition of human bodies into organic soil. And she came in and told me this idea 8 years ago, and it was like the wildest thing I had ever heard. But she continued, and we continued to support her and help her develop the idea where a human body is in this vessel, and then a month later, it becomes organic soil that is then sent to sustainable forests in the Pacific Northwest and is actually used to grow trees. And she was able to get the governor of this state and then other states to make this legal. And it is one of the most sort of organic and non-toxic processes. These are early studies that we did. And again, working with Ryan Botts in our office, and that's his wife, with a sheet over her on their dining room table that he turned into the images that began to help us create a new way of people ending their lives, and a different and perhaps healthier environment around this notion that their final act is actually a positive act as they move into the future. I'm closing with this project because you can't work on a project about death without thinking about your own death. And curiously, I was invited to participate in an exhibit at Yale University by an architect that had worked here as an intern. It was called In Memoriam, and they asked 50 different designers if they would design their own memorial, which is about the most deeply narcissistic thing probably a designer could ever be asked to do. But in this process, I realized that I, in fact, would be someone that would be turned into organic soil, and then I bought this, and I worked with the 3D modelers and Juan Ferreira in our office, who's a sort of brilliant model maker, as he sort of developed this idea of my recomposition and submitting a bottle of soil for the closing. There is no more autonomous act, I think, than the ways we enter the world and the ways we leave it. And with that, I'll end it there. I just want to close by saying, I wish we were together in Lisbon today. That would have been amazing. But stay in touch with me if you like. This is my Instagram contact number or address, and I try to respond to everybody that connects. So follow me, I'll follow you, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. Gosh, how precise your timing is. 30 seconds
I told you it took me
left.
45 minutes, right?
And I found qualities of precision in a lot of what you showed, but also of sort of deliberate dirtiness and grime. You don't seem like a practice that is afraid of the aesthetics or the rub of grunge. Am I right, or am I just assuming that because you're in Seattle, that this is part of your sensibility?
I think there is definitely something to that. I don't know if I would say that it was dirtiness per se, but we do love the patina of time and what happens in the patina of materials. And I'm currently working on a new museum project in Honolulu or exploring ideas for one there. And it is um, in a historic structure that actually it's 100 years old and was never intended to be a museum. And the work of the artists actually works better with this notion of wear and time and use than it does in a pristine white environment. And so we're kind of thrilled that we get to really work with what it is that concrete looks like after 100 years and the wear and tear. And very often we include sort of materials and leave the markings on the steel that the steel workers may have put, or the story behind the project. So in that sense, I think there is a connection to what grunge was about, although I think our interest in that predated the music in the 90s, in that notion of it isn't pretty, it's more raw and it's more visceral, and you're intended to feel it at the end of the day.
But it's not necessarily that kind of industrial rawness. Of course, there were industrial elements to what you showed, but I was sort of, just for example, you showed a model which was like a book. It's a hinge that opened up and you could see inside the building. And it was deliberately sort of patinated and dirty, let's say.
Yeah.
But it was also, I only saw it for a few seconds, as I'm sure the rest of the audience did, but it seemed incredibly precise in the way it was made, that the representation was accurate. So if the capital on a column or, details of a building that sort of acknowledge uh, uh, not just industrial, but sort of the kinds of forms that suit patination, that are inherited. And taking that notion forward, am I right in saying that every single project you've shown was in an existing building or the remains of an existing building? You're not architects, at least you're part of the practice. I don't know about the rest of all the other partners, but certainly you seem to be drawn to projects which set off in their sensibility from something inherited and something that has a depth of time.
I think that's, I appreciate that question, Nigel, because I think that that's actually really true. I am personally really inspired by the existing constraints of inheriting a site or inheriting an existing piece of architecture and then transforming its use into something else, but first coming in and trying to realize what the underlying logic of the original intention was, of the original designers and builders, and then from there moving on and adding to it. And every single cultural project I've shown you, from the Space Needle to the Bob Dylan Center to the project in Berlin is in an old flower market from 1962. I'm particularly inspired by found objects and collage and this idea of weaving in the past with the present. I very rarely do projects where I'm trying to make it look like the past. I'm always wanting it to be very, very clear when anybody walks in that was then and this is now. And that's something I learned when I studied. You and I talked before we jumped on about, I studied in Rome. When I was studying at the University of Washington, I got to study in Rome for 7 months. And one of the things that I learned there from designers like Carlos Scarpa and most people who are working in historic cities was just how important it is to make architecture of your own time when you're actually dealing with historic architecture as well. And so I would say that all of my partners work on sort of adaptive reuse projects, but they also work on original architecture, and I do as well. I just haven't shared those in this particular lecture.
Oh,
But
you've selected
predominantly, but predominantly, you're absolutely right. And every cultural project that I'm doing, including
so you wouldn't turn one down if it was a new building, but you're exceptionally
no.
inspired by rubbing up against places that exist. And I think there's another interest here also for those of us who've done a lot of interior work, but still consider it architecture.
Sure.
That the if you're working with old buildings or sort of, as I said, rubbing up against them, it's the distinction between the outside and the inside is blurred by comparison with conventional architecture. How do you feel about the distinction between interior and exterior?
I think this goes back to one of the excuse me, one of the earliest slides that I showed, where we were inspired by influences from Asia. And I think that one of the things that has happened in our practice, and I started here as a junior architect, but very early on, it was the relationship between inside and outside that actually is something that Jim Olson was working on as our founding partner, that I was really inspired by, and breaking down the lines that demarcate inside and outside. And you saw that in the model you mentioned earlier ago, where we're studying literally the intersection. And I'm behind me, there is a model of a museum that I designed. Maybe it's on this side. I'm pointing the wrong direction, but it's the right
brown
model.
outline. But
Sorry.
sorry, I got to pull you up on something. You've got interior designers in your team and architects in your team. So you
Absolutely.
still distinguish between them. Do you ever get the architect to design the interior and the interior designer to design the architecture?
All the time. And I think there's a very interesting line between the design of interior architecture and the entire of interior design. And we have an extraordinary team of interior specialists here, and they have deep, deep connections in materiality, a vast, vast library of options and so on. So the form is usually created by the architectural team initially. The interiors folks move in, but they're always working as a team and in collaboration. And so that's sort of the key piece there, and we have people with expertise in art collaborations and bringing in and they have deep bench of craftspeople, as I know you do in your practice, where that really inform the making of the ideas. But the line between where does the interior designer stop and where does the architects begin is actually extremely blurred and very intentionally blurred in our practice.
Do you ever trust architects with color?
I take it you don't, by your question.
Well, some architects have terrible, like Richard Rogers, bless him, if it wasn't primary, he wouldn't use it. Or James Sterling, terrible idea of color, ghastly.
Well, I think for us, the notions of color, and it's two directional, again, because we're blurring the lines between these divisions within our own practice and our own teams, is that, again, we start larger and we sort of work with the color palettes of the nature and the environment where we're located. And then that actually leads to the material palettes of the materials we're actually using inside. But then based on clients and interest, the variations in color selections and sort of the furnishings and the artwork and other things can go in so many surprising and interesting directions. And so, and the notions of color for us is really pretty wide, because you can walk into a site and grab some dirt and look at it and actually say, yeah, this is the color of what the interior space should look like. And so we do look to nature as a palette tool throughout the practice.
But you describe the way you work in teams, and I really empathized with your thing about working autonomously with your sketchbook and working in a team. And of course, when you work in a team, you try to coax out contributions from everybody, which enables them to give their best. And sometimes there'll be some kind of shock intervention, either from you or another member of the team. The way you describe it, it's all terribly kind of democratic and very sort of easy and perfectly, but everybody's contribution is sort of smoothly engaged with everyone else's. But I'm not getting a feeling that there's sort of any kind of sort of disruption in this process. Could you
Well,
can you
yeah,
can you sort of
no, I think,
feel a little bit
yeah,
more about kind of somebody comes along and said, that's a terrible idea. How will you cope with that?
well, I think that, I want to talk about it in a couple ways. When I started in the firm, and so again, this is over 30 years ago, I learned, as a sort of entry-level architect, and if there's any students listening, this is my advice in relationship to how to engage your own design ideas in a project, and this works for me as well, where the project begins and you're just getting started, and you're asked to develop some ideas to bring to the next meeting, and there's always a design lead on the project. So I don't want to be misleading in that. There is a role of art direction and synthesis that certainly I play in the initiation of these projects, unless I sort of shift off and I realize the team is moving and then they sort of can take over and go from there. But in the early days, I realized first thing I had to bring back, I would bring back 3 ideas every time I was asked as a junior architect. The first one would be what I thought the client was asking us to do. The second one would be what I thought the design lead on the project was asking me to do. And the third thing would be what it is I thought I should do or I would do on the project. And very often my ideas were not included, but over time, increasingly, they were embraced. And that's when it disrupted the project and actually changed it. And so there are times, again, on my very first museum, where I had been in the firm 3 years. I shouldn't have been designing an art museum, but in fact, many of my ideas were included. And so that is part of the practice of how that actually happens. There's a lot you have to learn in the path of becoming a designer and an architect, but from an idea perspective, I would say that in everything I showed you or tried to show you was the presence of ideas that were emerging and innovation that was happening at every level of a project, not just the completed building.
But if you're the lead designer, it's are you saying it's your responsibility to get to know the contribution of each member of the team well enough to be a time and the interest to look at what they're doing and to look carefully? It's quite delicate, isn't it? Because if somebody's ideas are rejected over and over, maybe, or they're ignored, let's say, maybe they're in the wrong team, or maybe they should be doing slightly different. I mean, it cuts both ways, is what I'm saying.
No, I think that's true. And one of the things I try to get people to realize early on is that we each, you may have a job where a person you work for, but you are actually personally responsible for your own career and your own decisions. And so you want to be in a place where your thinking resonates with the people around you and where you can actually be successful. And so, but one of the things that, I have good knowledge of the people that I work with on projects, and it starts with that intern lecture that I described at the very beginning, where I actually attend those lectures and I'm looking at their portfolios and I'm looking at their skill sets. And the model maker, for example, is someone that I realized in his presentation to the entire office of his work that was something we could use and that he would actually take us to a completely different place. The same is true of digital technology or people that had the ability to draw. So there are ways that you can actually enter into the profession without needing decades of experience, where creative decisions and the ability to influence a project happens.
Well, running a practice and retaining your creativity within it is a skill in its own right. I'm familiar with all of that, and I think
bet.
you've brought a great deal to the table for our viewers tonight. And thank you so much, Alan,
Thank
for
you,
sharing your
Nigel.
projects and your thoughts. Bye bye.
Goodbye. Be well, everybody.